So, hi, Bill Stuff. Next on our stage is Max Wippich. Have the attention here on stage. Shh, yeah. Next on stage is Mac Wippich. He's the Director of Client Experience and Business Development Efforts at Juvare, which means help in Latin. Just got to know that. He is focused in healthcare and public health initiatives, and over the past 15 years, he has held roles at Juvare across engineering, product management, sales, business development, and market leadership. And he is going to talk about tech leadership with a target on your back, racing tech titans to vaccinate millions. It's first time that Max is in Bill Stuff, so with a round of applause, let's welcome him on stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucas. So as I was saying, first time in Lithuania, so thank you for the hospitality and thank you to my coworkers, both here and hopefully watching live online as well. So couldn't be more excited to have the opportunity to share some stories and a little bit of background about myself, some of the experiences we've had building a vaccination management technology, kind of in a very short time frame, if you can imagine that. So without further ado, kind of jumping in, really quick background. My name is Max. As Lucas said, I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So similar weather, maybe about the same temperature, a little bit cloudier here. But hopefully we're going to have some fun in this presentation. I love telling stories. One of my objectives is, of course, to help you learn something and maybe see a little bit of different perspective in the world as well. So lots of similarities between Wisconsin and Lithuania. So maybe we'll talk about cheese and beer and basketball at some point as well. So at any rate, I've broken my story up into a couple of different chapters. And I'd feel remiss if I didn't just set some background concepts, give an introduction to Juvare, just so you have an understanding as to who we are and a little bit of my perspective in terms of where we came from and how we got into this fairly elaborate project. So with that, just in one overview, Juvare is a technology company. We've been in business for close to 30 years, and about 8 years ago, we opened an office in Kaunas, and a number of my colleagues, of course, joined. It's a beautiful office. You know, I think one of our HR people is here if you'd like a job, so just stop by if you would. But we're obviously a software company. We do some services, some training and things like that, but we primarily want to put good quality, high performance, reliable software out in the world. So for the most part, we don't have generic platforms. We have fairly specific solutions, and we'll talk about platforms versus solutions through the course of the presentation, but we have specific software products that solve specific objectives and needs for our clients. So you can see some of those software offerings, the core capabilities down the right side of the slide. Don't need to read them. I'll put them in context in terms of COVID and vaccination in a couple of moments. So one of the really interesting things about Juvare is our specific clients. So we say we're a resiliency technology company, and our traditional users and clients are those in emergency management or emergency services. So kind of some different context of that between the US and the EU, but traditionally it's the folks that help coordinate response, either preparing, responding, or recovering from disasters or emergencies, whether that's a day-to-day or a disaster that drags on for 2 or 3 years. So usually it's across, whether it's the first responders, law enforcement, healthcare, emergency response, or, private sector. Actually, the gentleman that was speaking earlier about the shipping companies, again, whether you're in a high-risk industry like shipping or just traditional industries like healthcare and public health that I come from, that's kind of our intent or our focus as an organization. So, other than that, we probably look like a pretty normal software business. In a nutshell, we're mostly low-code, no-code type technologies, other theme of my presentation, of course. And again, to specifically prepare for, coordinate preparedness, help you prepare, help you understand risks and threats that your business might face, respond to, so keeping people apprised, notifying them when there is a response, and then recovering from, making sure you improve and get better next time. You use data to improve your operations for future disasters that you might face. So from a software development perspective, again, pretty standard, slow, methodical, normal Agile, PI, Scrum methodologies that we use. We have traditional program increments about once a quarter. We have about an annual roadmap, and then we have a 3 and 5 year kind of vision horizon that we use for normal software development. But as I would say, storms are on the horizon, because when those disasters start to creep into our clients, we really need to address them in a specific way. And sometimes those disasters are the typhoons or hurricanes or heat waves in Europe. It just depends on the scenario. So I'd say the other thing that's really then kind of unique about our business is the ways in which urgency plays a factor in our business. So I tend to think of there's 2 different types of urgency that we face. There is, of course, those disasters. You don't necessarily see a hurricane coming more than 3 days in advance, and you might not know that it's a heat wave until the heat wave's already here, or those typhoons or other, terrorism and so forth. You don't necessarily see those coming in advance, and so you need to react very quickly to those as well. But given some of our clients, we also have daily urgency as well. So I'd say that it took me a couple of years to really understand that in working for the organization. The first 3 or 4, it was just bouncing from one disaster to the next. But over time, you really have to start to understand the other urgency that exists. And many of our clients are in governments, so they have government bureaucracy. And so when you have the attention of politicians and government officials, you need to capitalize on that very, very quickly and meet with them and answer their questions. And when you reach the top of the pile, you need to be ready to act. Other governments, they have regulatory things that they need to be concerned with, and there's very specific timelines for mitigating threats and risks and so forth. Other times there's funding and how money is allocated to do technology and software things, so that becomes a challenge as well. And of course, our customers have bosses and they have supervisors, and sometimes those supervisors and bosses are elected officials. And when something is a priority for an elected official, it's probably a priority for many other people as well, including us. So what that starts to provide for us is actually an opportunity. So when you're able to deal with the urgency well, for us, we can turn that into an opportunity. And I tend to think of the way we do that as being viewed through a lens of trust. And so, the goal of an individual, you kind of start with self-confidence, so believing in the mission and believing in what you do. So many of my colleagues came from emergency management, emergency services roles as they come to work for the organization. And so they're the frontline people. They believe in saving lives and helping and improve. And so that self-conviction, that self-confidence really helps in that. So you need to believe in your individual jobs, regardless of whether it's in software or leadership or otherwise. As you grow confident in your individual roles and your contributions, that starts to turn into interpersonal trust. So trust between you and your colleagues, so that you can rely on folks that you work with in a team and in a collaborative environment. So that starts to build, and as you develop interpersonal trust amongst your teams, you can turn that into organizational trust as well. So trust in those teams, in the organization in a broader picture, which finally you're able to translate into external trust as well, out to your customers, your stakeholders, the communities you work with and serve. And it's all of these things that need to start to work together, and I think it can be very difficult, obviously, but when it works together, there's at different stages of this, there's benefits that you can provide. And so when you have interpersonal trust, it starts to empower things like intellectual honesty. It allows you to have difficult conversations between each other with trust and respect. It allows you to have that intellectual honesty with clients. You can be an expert because you have self-confidence and you have institutional trust between you and them and the organizations that you're working with together. And it can give you a longer leash, I would say, to deliver quality software because they trust that you know what you are doing, both from an organizational perspective, an institutional perspective, and an individual perspective as an expert. So with that, again, wanted to set a little bit of a baseline. And as we get into chapter 2, I'd like to start framing or reminding us all, I'm sure we can't forget, but maybe what things looked like in late 2019, early 2020 before the world went sideways. So for us, the traditional, biggest and best part of the year for our clients was what we would call drills and exercises. So these are, they decide we're going to simulate a disaster of some sort, or simulate the coordination, preparedness, training for a disaster. And whether that's, pre-planned events like music concerts and those sorts of things, or literally just completely fabricated we call them exercises, this would be the biggest event of the year because they'd be on the calendar 6 months in advance, and when they get here, we'd all celebrate like it was somebody's birthday. And it was predictable. It was easy to plan for. We could know that we would send our teams to go work with these clients directly in the field, and it would give them a chance to play around. But it was usually a lower stress environment. It's not obviously a real disaster. Everybody knows about it in advance for the most part, and you get some experience, some context as to how you might actually use our technology products in a real event, but still some artificialities. And the point I want to start to make is that in our line of business, there have always been people that were experts in this field, in emergency management, emergency services, preparedness and response. And when we think about what they were doing pre-pandemic, they had already had some experience, some context that they had drawn from. And, they had, whether it's SARS in 2009 or Ebola or just annual influenza, annual flu, they had a decent idea as to what the impacts might be if there was a global pandemic. I might not have read those documents. I might not have known what they were thinking. But if you were to look at their documents, they did a pretty good job. I won't read every one of these, but they're pretty on the nose. And this came actually from one of our clients' pandemic preparedness plans, which was issued, and I think it issued in 2018 and updated in 2019 before they never had to update it again. But educational disruption, critical infrastructure disruptions, critical worker shortages, transportation, media, lockdowns, everything. It was really all in there. And obviously the very last one at the bottom, if I'm kind of standing in the way, is vaccination, which is one of the things that we saw, and of course, a lot of the substance of the presentation. So I challenge you to say, what did they miss? That's one of the things that folks are just starting to do now in our line of work, is try to say, hey, next pandemic, are there other things that we might do? And I'm not going to, kind of sit back and analyze that now in real time, but there's some very hard intellectual honesty type conversations that are happening in our client sites that are doing exactly that right now and will be for years to come. So with that, of course, all of a sudden, suddenly virtual. In early March, I was, of course, visiting a client, and the first inkling I really had, I had seen some things coming out in January and February, but I was coming through the airport and I saw on CNN that I think Europe was locking down. So, you locked down maybe a week or so earlier than the US, but it obviously started to happen. And that was, of course, going to be the very last time I was in an airport or an airplane for a very long time, almost the longest time in my life. And then we started to see the effects unfold. So, of course, first, maybe you bought stock in Netflix and Zoom and those other, collaborative technologies that all of our, our technical support people implemented for all of us overnight. We were kind of casual Zoom users, and then all of a sudden it was, 6 hours of my day was spent on Zoom. So again, kudos, hats off to the engineers and tech support services everywhere that implemented those for us. And then really we started to say, we have some free time. Who's going to pick up some hobbies, whether it's new reading books or whatever, but everybody has a little bit more free time because we're working from home, and of course, not as much, not commuting to the office and so forth. So from there, it's this is probably going to blow over quickly, right? How delusional were we? It's going to be 2 weeks, and then we'll probably come back. We'll smash this pandemic, and then we'll be back in the office, by early April. So, of course, how wrong were we? I think it's a little bit different for Juvari and some of our colleagues because, again, this is kind of our market. These are the sorts of things that our clients count on us for. So our first 2 weeks and then 2 months looked quite a bit different. And this is where we really start to pick up some of our different technologies and how they had an impact in the broader response across some of our U.S. clients, some of our European and clients otherwise around the world. So one of the first technologies to really take off was we have an alerting tool, which is used to send messaging and documentation securely to public health officials and healthcare officials. And so, we saw the messaging start to ramp up as people were writing new guidance and distributing lessons learned on the fly. You saw things coming out of out of the kind of Central Europe and Italy, and then those are being analyzed by CDC and others, and then passed forward and cascaded through the healthcare system globally. So that was kind of the first thing we saw. The next thing we saw was contact tracing, and actually we have a couple of different technologies that helped facilitate the case management and contact tracing. The National Public Health Center here in Lithuania actually used one of our technologies to facilitate much of the COVID response. So that was kind of an interesting line for us to provide that capability to them as well. And then we started to see constraints on healthcare capacity. So hospitals filling up, not having resources, not having beds. And we have technology that helps analyze that, visualize that, and balance the load, I would say. We started to see other resource constraints, the masks, running out of masks, gloves, gowns, those sorts of things. We have inventory management technologies that helped facilitate that. And then we started to see by the end of that 2-month window, month and a half window, we started to see what we call responder management or volunteer management as well, where the first wave of the healthcare workforce was sick with COVID, and so we needed to bring additional folks in as well. And so we have technologies that helped facilitate that process. So, my point is that the first 2 months of COVID were not like we didn't get to pick up those hobbies, unfortunately, because all of our other solutions were starting to take off at that exact same time. So it was kind of fun. But as this was happening, we had something in the back of our mind, one of our other technologies that we're like, we don't need it quite yet, but we're going to soon. And I would say this is kind of like our pandemic deja vu. Folks may or may not remember the 2009 pandemic that never really was. And what had happened is back in 2009 when H1N1 was kind of on the horizon, we had spent a couple of months of time, seeing that, working with some clients. We were a lot smaller organization then, but we had started to add a couple of very basic features and functions that might help, with a pandemic response. And we had added some features to track medications or vaccinations that might be administered. And we had built this little web app that was very specific to do just the documentation of the vaccination. And then, we'd also built some ancient mobile apps that use some proprietary hardware and a bunch of other stuff because we didn't really have iPhones or Android phones back in 2009. But we had built these fairly rudimentary public health features to do a pretty specific and pretty narrow set of things. And obviously, by today's standards, I had to pull up my my screenshots from that are like 12 years old to get these. But we had at least curated some experience. We had some experience and context as to what might eventually be required, a couple of months from now as we were sitting in, April and May of 2020. So really with that, I think the difference with a pandemic versus some of the other things we do, similar but different, where, with a hurricane, you can see it coming for 5 days. For COVID, we saw, 8 or 9 months, maybe. You might, by 2 or 3, we'll talk about that in a minute. It was kind of new, but it was similar that we had some time to prep. We didn't need to have it perfect off the shelf in May or April of 2020. We had a little bit longer to do it. But in the same way, we didn't know exactly who our customers were going to be. So we had a little bit of that vision, but we didn't know whether it, maybe this is just a bit of the wonkiness of the American healthcare system, but was it going to be hospitals or pharmacies, or was it going to be the governments that helped coordinate and facilitate vaccination? And so we had some of those unknowns. We had some of that ambiguity where we didn't know exactly all the details as to how this is going to work. In a similar way, both hurricanes and pandemics, whether this is the 1918 flu or otherwise, they are what we think of as population scale events. So in a hurricane, it's localized. It's everybody in the state of Florida. A typhoon, it's everybody in Malaysia. It's everybody, that's in the path of this storm or other natural disaster. In a pandemic, it is truly population scale. It's 7 billion people, all are going to be impacted in some way or another. And this, obviously from the perspective of public health, this is the largest public health event in human history. It'll, unless we have another pandemic, it'll probably be the largest one for some time, fingers crossed. But, we had these unknowns. We knew that the pandemic was coming and we would have to do vaccination at some point at the end of it all. So that brings us to chapter 3, which we refer to as mass vax or just vax, but massive vaccination or population scale prophylaxis. So And time is ticking. So as we started to think about that, again, just to recap 2019, we had this, this crazy idea. We had this time crunch, but we had developed trust with our clients. Again, by that point, we had been in business about 20 years, specifically in lines of work with public health and healthcare preparedness and response. We had that initial product. Wasn't great, but we at least had an idea as to the features and functions it may require and an understanding as to how it was relevant. And then with that context of urgency, we knew that when a hurricane comes at us, we could pivot and we could address things very, very rapidly. And so really it was a question of doing this at the same scale or the scale that was required for that. So to start to frame out the timeline, we see January 20th, very first cases detected in the US. I say first detected because, of course, there were probably dozens by that point, just not detected because testing was terrible at that time. March 6th, I went to a wedding, and I went on that client visit. So just as Europe was about to lock down, again, we're oblivious, don't really know that it's going to come to us, or we think that just there's a couple of cases, so it's not going to impact us. So I was probably like many of you. I didn't think it was serious, or I didn't think it was serious enough. By March 15th, that's the US lockdowns, and so our European colleagues were already kind of huddled up, and that brought that to the other 2/3 of our workforce in the States as well. And by late April, people are kind of letting this drag on. The shutdowns are persisting in many areas, and folks, as I said, are finding hobbies. So at the time, when I wasn't working, we would just go on walks around the neighborhood. I've got a young son, and my wife and I would just be walking around the neighborhood. And I thought it was very entertaining that people didn't know at that time. And so as you'd be walking and someone else would be walking down the block, it was a game to see who would cross the street to get away from the other people. And so we had a stroller, we had a pram with our son in it. And so that was like we had some seniority because we had a stroller. If somebody was on a bike, they'd have to leave. If they had a dog, there'd be a hierarchy established of who had to, get out of the way for the other people because nobody wanted to be within 6 feet or 1 meter of each other, 2 meters of each other. So by early summer, reality is obviously setting in. We think this is here to stay. This isn't going to just blow over. Pretty much unilaterally, political leanings aside. And then by late July, which is absolutely amazing, by the way, but by late July, we're actually starting to see initial hints about vaccine effectiveness trials, which is, a completely other presentation topic about the modern medicine and how quickly we're able to bring those to market. But just over, 4, 5, 6 months to have vaccines that ultimately were, cleared through clinical trials and vaccinated a couple billion people. That's incredible in its own right. So as that kind of those final tail ends was happening, the reality setting in and vaccine effectiveness trials, in the States, we started to see some hints of the role of government in the vaccination, which ultimately had a big role in our approach. Again, wasn't consistent everywhere, but in the US, many governments took a fairly strong role versus delegating that to the healthcare system like hospitals. So with that, I'd say from March 15th onwards, Europe and the US were largely in sync in the timelines and the way that things were impacting us. So as we get into late 2020, all summer long, we started to understand this, and so we started to be meeting with clients. And this was, we start with some of our colleagues in Europe, and I would pick up later in the evening, so from about 6 a.m. to about 11 p.m. every single night, it would be meeting with clients, doing demos, and the joke I make is it's like speed dating, because someone would call you, at 8 in the morning, you'd have a meeting with them at lunch, and then by 9 or 10 p.m. at night, you've done a demo for them, and then the next day you spend negotiating the contract for them to buy the software that they just saw demoed for the first time 12 hours ago. So it was very, very quick, very, very cyclical, and very, very repetitive, and obviously very stressful. As we get into September, we start to see formal plans being published. That's just kind of a thing. The planning section putting out their formal documents as to how they're going to address vaccine campaigns. And most of them hinted, if not outright said, we're planning on January of 2021 as the start date for their mass vaccination campaigns. And that generally, of course, held up. By October 6th, we had our first solid verbal client commitment. It took longer because people didn't know, again, what role was going to happen, but by most measures, that's the start of our true clock in terms of developing and committing to do all the functionality things that we had been promising, all summer long. We finalized that scope about a month later on November 15th, and then they actually finally signed, like formally signed, the contract on December 10th. And then 4 days later, December 14th, first shots in the U.S. So we could say it was 2 months. We could say it's 4 days. I'll be honest here, but it obviously all happened very, very quickly as understanding persisted and people determined what they were going to do to meet this need. Many of them were even shorter than this. So obviously I shouldn't say obviously, but from our perspective, our focus was not really just the very, very first vaccinations. Our focus was, again, mass vaccination, population scale. Because of course, for the first couple of days, there were a couple thousand shots in the entire world, or at least in the entire U.S. It was later on that we wanted to pick up what we call that population scale vaccine capability. So between January 11th and January 13th, two important things happened from my perspective. One, we had a baby. My wife had a baby. So if you remember those long walks, it was because my wife was pregnant. We were just walking around the neighborhood. And so at that exact same time, within 2 days, we were then starting large-scale public health vaccinations as well. So for me, it was a very stressful time because we were, launching the product into the world. But at the same time, life doesn't stop, right? Your personal lives don't stop when there's milestone events in work as well. So that's obviously a good reminder for me anyway. And from here, I could just stop and say from January, the second week in January onward, the rest is history because it just grew and grew and grew. But for us, there was one specific additional milestone that we needed to check off. And I frame this as, creating a physical manifestation of software. But there's a concept called the super site, which was one of the measures that many governments, including the U.S., took to help reach that population scale magnitude. So to kind of frame that out, from vaccination approaches, there were really three different kind of categories that we ended up touching on, and this is just a broad generalization, but the first category was, what we call closed sites. We closed pods, points of dispensing. And these early on were, they would vaccinate all the clinicians in a hospital. They would vaccinate all of the workers in a food processing plant, truly the essential workforces, to make sure that COVID didn't get in there and spread and then completely disrupt the supply chain, the food supply, or other critical resources. So we did a couple of those early on. From there, we started to see just smaller scale public vaccination sites, your local pharmacy, smaller size ones, local departments of health, public and privately funded, just depending. But that third category, which we called the super sites, were very, very, very large scale, in most cases federally funded, but collaborative efforts between governments, public and private, and they were single locations that were responsible for doing between 7,000 and 10,000 vaccines a day. So in aggregate, hundreds of thousands to millions of shots at a single site location, which is just a around the clock assembly line of vaccinating people. So and what we had to do was take our technology and be able to wrap all of those different types of approaches into one software package. This is the set of requirements from our very first customer contract. Don't need to read it all, but it's less than 200 words. So something at this scale to be distilled down to 200 words that everybody agreed on, the politicians would sign off on. That's again a different story. But I think what's important to look at here is that some of these individual requirements, they're very much loaded with context and additional meaning that might not be obvious to other people looking. So like SMS messaging, right? That can mean many different things. But to us, just having the context, having the experience and awareness was very, very important to be able to unpack that and then implement features that were SMS messaging, but in the context of a large-scale population vaccine event. So that's obviously, that's like patient reminders, show up to your appointment, get your second dose, that sort of thing. That's the SMS messaging that we ended up implementing. But if you didn't have that, it would be difficult to understand the context behind it. And again, about 2.5 to 3 months tops that we had to implement all of this with the dozens of other pages of requirements that each one of these kind of can unpack. And you can see a lot of software, a lot of services, training, and so forth. We're implementing this for thousands of clinicians that are using it to document these vaccinations. So again, different type of challenge organizationally and leading through that. And I think it brings me to the point, with that expertise and experience we had, where I think one of the things we had that some of the tech titans may not have had was what I would call proximity to expertise. And so you look at a large organization, right? They've got hierarchy, they've got a team of business analysts that are looking at individual features and functions. I think we were the right-sized organization to pull it off because we had much closer proximity. We had a flatter organization, and we were able to embed a lot of our resources much more closely with the clients. Didn't overdo it, and I think there's I won't say there's a right way and a wrong way to approach this, but from us, it was something where we almost limited engagement with our engineering just to try to streamline the process. And I think a lot of this comes back to that trust that I was talking about, having trust amongst the teams. And when I've been working for the organization for close to 15 years, I've got colleagues that have worked 20 and 25 years. Many of my Lithuanian colleagues are coming up on 10 years at this point. Lacking that trust would have been a detriment to our ability to execute on this project, certainly in the timeline, but also in terms of the software and the quality that we put out as well. So a lot of that, again, that trust, that focus, that discipline can be very important. And I frame this as proximity to experience, and if it's closer, and sometimes better is the enemy of good enough, which is something, of course, we learn in iterating software in the MVP or the MMVP and those types of approaches as well. So with that, again, kind of to the reality versus expectations, we get into midsummer and we get into the first vaccine contracts in fall and winter, and we're getting comfortable. We're going to manage this pandemic on Zoom. And I think that, back to the super sites, that was obviously not going to be the case when our clients decided they wanted to put out, or they wanted to stand up some of those locations that were going to do 7,000 to 10,000 vaccines a day. And so I frame this point in my life as how I lived in a parking lot for 12 weeks, which is what they did for most of these sites. And this one that I've got over on the side of the screen, that's in downtown Chicago, or just adjacent to the city center in downtown Chicago. And kind of two phases. On the top phase, that was the first phase, and then the lower one, of course, taken from a helicopter just to try to get a sense of the scale. It's nearly 4 city blocks long. So this is a huge site, 4 urban city blocks. Just to get they had a drive-through, they had a walk-up, they had transit lines, and kind of an elaborate series of queues and lines to stand in to get through the process. But it was taking the experience we had and then turning it into a physical manifestation, which is something we hadn't done in the pandemic. We had done it pre-pandemic, but we hadn't been able to actually translate the software product into a real-world series of workflows that, again, a team of our staff flew out and supported and stood there and helped train and optimize the software over the course of about 12 to 16 weeks, and then a couple of different phases there as well. So pictures don't do it justice, but I think the other important thing here was, again, time crunch. We got a call about a week before that site was going to open, where the governor, the mayor, and folks were, they were standing in front of the site on a stage, and they were, seeing the forklifts build the site behind them. And then we get the calls like, yeah, we want to use your software there. It's like, oh boy. So we ultimately had about 24 different folks that rotated through the site, but it was really a tremendous experience, and I could tell stories about that all day. So at any rate, the site itself came with some very, very specific challenges, as you might imagine. I mentioned one, it's highly visible. There's intense media scrutiny. Anytime we would make even a minor configuration change, there would be a news article about it in significant press outlets locally to Chicago, of course, the 3rd biggest city in the country. But there was buttons that I clicked that I know there was a news article. There's somebody that saw that and wrote a news article about it, which is mind-blowing. But these things had impact, right? And the second kind of nuance with this particular site was it was staffed in partnership between federal agencies, including the Department of Defense. So we had active duty military members because there were so few other clinicians around at the time, but we had active duty military members that were providing the vaccine itself. So the actual clinicians were active duty. That had never been done before. to be clear. There had never been an active duty civilian hybrid mission quite like that, which was pretty incredible. And along with that, there were generals that wanted to come tour the site, and those political leaders. We had senators and congressmen and all sorts of other people come through the location wanting to see just what the heck this thing was, because they were reading about it in the newspaper. And with that, everybody has their own opinion, so the constant little tweaks and adjustments, whether they were our idea or our clients' ideas or some elected officials, have to take that into account as well. As well as what we call the RFI, the request for information. It's like, oh, hey, how many Pacific Islander women did you vaccinate yesterday? It's like, I don't know, but I can run a report to figure that out. And so there was those constant stream of questions and discussions that were obviously a challenge. And of course, just being physically there, somebody goes and finds you even if you're not the right person. And so I'm closer to the business than I am to the technology. So when I get the technical questions, sometimes I need to squirm a little bit. But when you're physically present, you feel a duty and an obligation that really sinks in. And then finally, I kind of mentioned it already, but the site was open nonstop. They didn't take Easter off. They didn't take the 4th of July off. It was open nonstop from, I think it was March 9th or March 7th is the soft open, for 12 to 16 weeks through the different phases. So that also means that from 8 a.m. until 7 p.m. when the site closed today, it was a steady, constant stream of people. I built the capacity plan for that site, and the time slots were every 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes, it could be as many as 200 people showing up to get their vaccine. And so, if there's a hiccup, if there's downtime, if there's anything that goes wrong, every 15 minutes there's going to be 200, 200, 200, 200 more, and it's just going to be nonstop until the site closes at night. And, the way the capacity ramped up, that gets harder and harder as the site progressed through the course of the day and weeks as the site was open. And I cannot stress how stressful it was to be standing there when there were a few bumps. We had different integration services that had hiccups and bumps, one of them with our mobile app, one of them with a third-party provider that we use to do some regulatory reporting. And it's extremely difficult when there's, again, generals and senators and normal site leadership looking at you for the answers, and you absolutely do not have them because your colleagues, you have the trust in your colleagues to fix it, but you have no power to fix it because you're just standing in the middle of a parking lot. So, lots of fun. So I guess to bring us to chapter 4, I start to reflect on some of those experiences. And in addition to the urgency and trust and relationships, I think one of the other keys that we brought to the equation, again, I hinted at this, but it was our solution versus platform type approach. And, I guess that animates too quickly. Anyway, I want to just define that quickly and frame out how I think of it. So again, one guy's opinion, but when we were getting into this project, we had a couple of choices. And I think the way I could paint this is philosophically, we had a subject matter expertise, and we had an existing technology stack that could theoretically build this thing new from the ground up. That's what I would call a platform. It's a generic platform. It's a bunch of microservices stitched together, or whatever it is, or features and functions stitched together to do something from scratch, versus a product or a solution that you've been building for a long time to specifically do a narrow set of purposes. So again, most of our business fits into that solution category. But it was a call that we had to make. And so when we were weighing, the different options for a platform approach, build it from scratch and scale it up versus a solution, ultimately we need to decide whether we think that we can meet enough of the requirements with a generic platform, or if we could meet more of them with, building on an existing technology and augmenting and furthering the approach. So, different people might disagree. And again, other vaccination technologies certainly took the vaccination platform approach. I kind of like where we landed, because I think as I frame that, would you rather scale something existing that has already been proven to users? Again, we had 2009 and we had 10 or 12 years of other, development iteration. Or would you rather build something from the ground up designed to scale? So I'd almost ask for an opinion, but I think the challenge that we faced was we had a really good solution. And as I animate this, just to give you a sense of scale, that's a snapshot from our S3 bucket on one of the days we went live. And so that's 50 million requests in a 5-minute window for vaccination appointments, so kind of a lot, because everybody wanted a vaccine appointment right when they went live. And I don't know if that changed anything for us, but we needed to be very cognizant as to how quickly these things needed to go live. And the other challenge we faced was there's no do-overs, right? We can't just, we're going to, do another beta or another alpha round. It's like everything needs to be ready on day one. Whether it's day one in December or January, didn't matter. But as they started to put shots in arms, we needed to be ready and off to the races on that. So this is ultimately what we ended up delivering, just at a really high level. I could spend, this is my speed dating pitch, but dashboards and mobile apps and self-service appointments and notifications and reports. It was all there. I could obviously do a demo of this technology, but I won't. And then this is kind of what the patient journey looked like, communicating with them in advance, giving them appointments, helping select them and narrow down an appointment, administering the vaccine, documenting the clinical aspect of it. There was regulatory requirements we had to meet, and then reporting things out through the back end, whether it's doing second doses and boosters or alerting them and facilitating the inventory management. Our goal was, again, to have a complete, all-encompassing solution that met all of the objectives of our clients. And these two slides try to illustrate just what that looked like. Which starts to bring me to the epilogue, the other fun stuff. I know I'm at a tech conference, so I feel obligated just to show a snapshot of our architecture. So obviously, CloudFront up top, this thing is huge, but pretty traditional. I won't, again, I'm not necessarily the right person to unpack all of this, but you're welcome to take a peek, and maybe one of my colleagues can help during Q&A. Other cool things, we got to see some really neat data come back out of this. I geek out on this stuff just a little bit, but this is one of my favorites. We called this the timeliness report. So this shows how prompt people were for their appointments, early, late, and this is charted through the course of time. So as the site opened, where the pink bar is, you can see just as people, as vaccines got out there into the world at our site and other sites, you could see that people became a little bit more relaxed. They weren't necessarily as on time for their appointments. There's many ways to also slice this based on how far they were driving from, and socioeconomic groups and all sorts of other things, or age. That was another really interesting one, is age. The older people were very, very prompt. So you could see some of that coming through. And again, we have tens of millions of data points now on vaccination. So we can do some of this stuff now to, of course, improve for next time, which again is what a lot of our clients are doing. I also, again, want to offer some kudos and thanks to my colleagues. Again, I said that I'm kind of settling some bets by coming over here to give this presentation, but really the hat's off. This is a team effort, and really what illustrated that for me was actually that center picture on the bottom there. I was attending a conference, a public health conference in the States a couple of months ago, and the slide that I took a picture of is KCHD, which is the Kane County Health Department. That's the health department that is where I grew up. They specifically bulleted out Juvari EM-Track system as one of their keys to success. There's only 4 keys to success on their slide, and we're one of them, which I take as a personal point of tremendous pride, and also many of my colleagues. You can see our Lithuanian office and some of our other colleagues on the slide. Again, I really tip my hat to them as well. So with that, again, thank you guys very much. Hospitality was wonderful. I'd love to take a couple of questions if Lucas... And a sip of water.
A round of applause for Max. First
yes,
of all.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Max. Now it's time for questions and answers. Do we have any here?
I can go back to the architecture slide if people really want. No.
Well, I was wondering about the clients. It wasn't maybe clear to all the occasions what were the clients. Usually it's health departments. What are the clients of yours?
Yeah, primarily, kind of 3 different groups. The largest was government health agencies, government health departments, public health departments. Yeah, that was the largest. We had private companies that had critical workforces that we worked with as well. And then we had other, traditional hospitals and pharmacies and those types of organizations too. But our largest one was certainly the...
And you mentioned that you had, one of your solutions is actually a plan how to prepare for pandemic situations.
Not necessarily our solution, but our solution...
It includes, right?
Yeah, it helps document and, make checklists and those sorts of things that facilitate
Yeah,
make it easier to implement when it happens.
so what was the feeling to watch the pandemic happening and knowing that you have tools that a lot of organizations could use? But I wonder, did you see a lot of these plans being used actually in the real world? Did you see that emergency agencies, maybe not your clients, have these plans? They are really useful or not?
Yeah, I think answering the question a little bit different way. As I was building this presentation, it was almost therapeutic to go through the exercise, to think about it, to see what we did, what we didn't do, and how to get better. And I think our clients had a similar mentality as well. It's, many of them, they do planning on an annual cycle. And so, each year they might focus on a different threat or hazard. And so they might have been a long time before they had done a pandemic, but it's a good exercise just to think through and take a step back and focus specifically on the plan. So that's an entire discipline of emergency management and emergency services. There's people that have PhDs in plan writing and things like that. So I'm not that type of person.
Yeah, but would you say it was useful?
Absolutely.
Because we get the message that pandemic is something that no one could really plan for, and you say we have plans for preparing for a pandemic.
Trust.
So, trust.
Okay. Yeah. So they trusting an expert, and I think that's one of the takeaways I would give is. When there is somebody who is an expert in that field, and there's a gentleman I know, he's been a public health expert for almost 30 years. That's his plan that I showed with those bullet points. Some people trusted and some didn't, but as things unfolded, it's a build, the trust was building, and he was able to, show, yes, we know what this is, we know we can do our jobs. This is not a political thing, it's just I am the expert here, so.
Okay, let's leave it here with the trust. So once again, a round of applause for Max for a presentation.
Thank you.
And now it's lunchtime. So 1 hour for lunch and see you 10 minutes to 2.